just love local history, and I'm just obnoxiously crazy about it. I do love this museum. And I've written several books about different communities, but last year in the midst of COVID, Arcadia Press, I had written a book on haunted history, which was so much fun. We have a lot of haunted buildings around the county. But anyhow, they wanted me to come up with another, they really wanted me to write, I think, about San Antonio or a couple other places. And I said, you know, I'm kind of tired of that. They're so interesting, but I sort of have to take a break. And my youngest daughter, Rachel, was home from Stetson, and she was studying for the bar, and she was a little crazed by that, wasn't she, Ernie? But anyhow, she said, oh, Mom, you know, you should write a book, and it should be called Trailblazing Women. So that's where the idea came from. But anyhow, we just had a lot of fun. A lot of people helped me, and in the period of COVID, you could not get into the libraries, you couldn't get into the museums. So the Tampa Bay History Center was just phenomenal to help me. The Hillsborough Genealogy Library, we literally would get like a list of folks to look for, scan, and we talk on the phone, that kind of thing. And so many other sources. But we came up with this book about just inspirational trailblazing women. And I was thinking tonight, rather than go over a lot of history and that kind of thing, I would invite some of those people to come talk to you. So I'm just going to say a few words, and then we're going to hear from 5 remarkable women who are still here to talk about this. I mean, as they didn't leave or anything. So here we go. The cover of the book goes with kind of a classic model of women in employment. This is World War II, and it's a Rosie the Riveter kind of person. This was Margaret Clark Miller McCloskey. She worked at basically the stockyards kind of in Tampa, and was a welder. And she's kind of a interesting lady. The publishing company chose that picture. At first I was like, I had in mind a couple of local people I thought would be great for the picture, but I think it does capture a spirit. A lot of women went back to work, or went to work for the first time during that period. Just a couple of editorial remarks. There are people in our American history that represent women in strength, and of course Eleanor Roosevelt is one of those women. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, I'm totally blocking it. Okay, there you go. Eleanor Roosevelt is definitely one of these people. I always loved that quote about well-behaved women really make history, because I think so often we had these norms that came through centuries and centuries, and they are still with us to some extent today. And so when a woman stepped up, you know, made a challenge, did something a little bit different, there were tags identified with that. I love to tell this story. Danny Burgess, I won't go into detail, but he wrote this little promotion for my book, and I absolutely like it. He is a young man in the state legislature who's just really interested in history. He always calls me, or his staff call me if they're doing something, and they just kind of want to know what the history was. They probably call some other historians too, but it's really nice that he does that, so that was a fun thing. Of course, one of my favorites was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for a lot of reasons too, and that's not a political statement, but I couldn't be the mother of two female attorneys and not really think the world of her and the innovative work that she did and the pioneering work she did as a mother. And, okay, trailblazer. I like the term trailblazer because I think it depicts all kinds of trails. If you look at my book, you'll actually see people that were physical trailblazers in Frontier, Florida. And then you'll see women that were trailblazing in different occupations and fields. I was thinking tonight just a few comments, and I don't want to go into any detail, but you think of human history in Florida. We tend to think of that as being Andrew Jackson, that period of time. It it goes back thousands and thousands of years. And these indigenous peoples are anonymous. But when you go and look at the mounds, the burial mounds like the one in Olsner, in Port Richey, and others in this area, a lot of them have been just kind of eradicated. There were many, many in Dade City. But you have to think about, when you look at the lithics, the women who sustained their families, not just the women, but the men, of course, too. And to me, they're kind of like this nameless population, but every group stands on their shoulders. I think it's really significant to think of the Seminole Wars, and then the Armed Occupation Act, and the Homestead Act that brought people here to settle land. And it was like the wild, wild west. Mosquito-laden, many, many families, lost family members from disease and all kinds of things. But again, think of those kind of stepping stones. Women, when you do genealogy, and I bet a lot of people in this group do genealogy, a lot of times you'll have trouble finding the woman's first name, or you can't find her maiden name, or when you find her maiden name, it's misspelled. That used to kind of drive me crazy when I first started doing our family's genealogy. But the point is, women could not own property. There's so many things that they could not do until very, very late in time. I always tell people to read A Land Remembered. If you haven't read that novel, it gives you a really good, by Patrick Smith, it gives you a really good idea of what it was like in Florida. These are a couple of my frontier women that were true trailblazers. I did want to just briefly mention suffragettes, because when we're doing the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, we couldn't find any suffragettes in this area. But I did discover there were some in Tampa. One who is on the Walk of Fame there is Eleanor Collier McWilliams Chamberlain. She's probably the most significant Florida suffragette. And what I discovered with this book is there were the Robbins women in Hernando County in Brooksville, Amani is nodding his head, but at Chinsegut, Margaret Dreyer Robbins and Elizabeth Robbins. Elizabeth Robbins actually bought that property. It wasn't her brother. And she was an actress. She worked with Emmeline Pankhurst in London. She owned a home in Chicago. She wrote a play about the suffragettes, and she was really significant. So I think we can credit them. Of course, Pasco County was part of Hernando County during some of that time. But they were amazing suffragettes, and they hosted Jane Addams at Chinsegut. They were very liberal. They were very criticized, I should say, but they brought a lot to that area. When the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, we did have that year before, or maybe the 2 years before, we had some Florida women that were starting to get into the program. And a lot of that was because of women's clubs and Eastern Star and local organizations where they started getting their voice. It really was not acceptable, with very few exceptions, for women to speak in public. You could be a nurse or a teacher, and even sometimes those were very strict in terms of the protocol. But there was a push right before the amendment passed. These are some of the gals that were involved in it. You probably heard of Kate Jackson. My book covers the Tampa Bay area, but you'll see that it leans very heavily on Pasco and Hernando. I had a lot of people that suggested various people to me. Scott Black from our city council wanted me to be sure and include Sadie Pearl Gibbs Martin, who was the mayor of Plant City for a long time. Willa Rice, up here with the city council in Zephyr Hills, was the one and only woman mayor there. But I tried to look at mayors, city council folks, and what have you, when they first started being elected. Some were elected before they had the right to vote. Oh, whoops. I mentioned about the various groups. Some of the local people, I thought I'd just mention a couple of people you may or may not know. People know about the significance of Gail Sierens. We used to watch her all the time. Okay, the first woman to do the sports casts on the NFL, and she still holds that first distinction. Lucy Morgan, one of my old bosses, Dr. Mary Giella, said you have to have Lucy in this, and she was a reporter. She's still a reporter. She lives in Tallahassee, but she was just a courageous journalist who refused to give up her sources on a story of local government in this area, actually. And the case was held up for 3 years. Her children thought she might be going to jail any day, but in the end, she was cleared on it, or whatever the terminology would be. Lynn would know that. I wanted to mention Greta Adams. How many of you knew Greta Adams? Wonderful Greta. She was such a pioneering local woman, a school administrator. She was, I believe, the first woman high school administrator. Could be. She was at Pasco High School for many years, taught vocational program, and then she was the principal at Pasco Middle School. But she started the SAISA's program in a period of time when we were losing tons of girls, and boys actually too, from the high schools because they were pregnant, or they were sometimes just signed out of school. But they started this, it was very innovative when they started it in the early 80s. And they had a daycare program at Moore Mickens, and the girls and even the fathers had instruction there. And Greta, if you knew her, you knew her. She was just a personality. She was kind of a cross between the country. She was kind of like Dolly Parton, and she was also like the one with the tag. What's her name? Minnie Pearl. She was kind of a cross between them. But when she opened her mouth, I mean, she was so well read and so well versed, but she could communicate and bring people together in the most profound way. In fact, they invited her and some of her girls to be on Oprah. In fact, she was covered all over the country, but somehow they did not give the girls the right. Were you there, Bermice, when this? No. You weren't. Yeah, I didn't know if you were more making sense. But anyhow, she took care of that whole situation. She corrected Oprah and everybody. But she was just an amazing individual. We lost her much too young. And I think many of the school administrators still kind of stand on her shoulder. One of the people I met as a part of this book is a world-renowned opera singer named Jeanette Thompson.
She's from here.
She is from here. And I just thought, like I said, I thought I'd throw out a few local people that you may not know. I did not know her, and several people mentioned her to me, and we had an opportunity to interview her. In fact, Richard Riley and I were on the phone for about 3 hours talking with her, but she grew up in the Jim Crow South in Dade City, and we said to her, how did you find out about opera? And she said, I listened to the Late Show, and there would be some singers there. And she had a natural ability and talent, but she discovered what opera was, and eventually she was invited to sing on a regular schedule at the Rotary Club, the Women's Club, the Garden Club, all these places, and they would give her a stipend, and then she would be able to go to the summer singing camps at FSU. One of the professors at St. Leo was at one of those meetings, and he said, bar nothing, I'm going to teach her how to sing. Larry, Sledge, Larry Sledge was, and he taught her for like 6 years or something without any fee. And she is a world-renowned opera singer. She sings all over the world. She's won the Elizabethan competition at the international level. She's right now teaching at the University of Miami. But she said to me, it was Dade City that made me. Her most poignant story she told me was when the schools had just integrated, and they were sitting in the auditorium of Pasco Middle. She goes, what a dumb thing to do. They had just integrated the schools and they had the kids sitting in the auditorium. And a lot of you will remember that. It still looks pretty much the same. And she said, the white kids didn't want to be there, the black kids didn't want to be there. And she said, for some reason, the principal left the room. And she said there was no fighting, but everybody was just like, so she said, I don't know what possessed me, but I just walked up to the stage and I started playing Beatles songs. Hey Jude, you know? And she told me, I don't know why, but I'm fearless. I've done that my entire life when I've used music. So I think she's probably one of the most famous people from Dade City.
Also the youngest, I can't remember whether there are 16 of them or 13 of them.
In her family.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. She told me some of the most amazing stories. We actually put it on 5a.org, but even some situations, and I shouldn't get off topic, but even some situations where she was in physical danger, and she used music to solve the problems. And I think she uses that with her students still today. I just am amazed with her. And Imani, their group just recently had an opportunity to recognize her.
We recognize that Paso Hernandez State College for Paso Noble Black History Month.
So that was amazing. But we need to name something after her. We need to do something with Jeanette Thompson. She is amazing. Who else was I thinking of? A person I discovered in the quest was a Land O'Lakes lady named Mabel Helis Bexley. Her daughter was at our last presentation, but she was one of the founders of the Spring in Tampa, and her story is just amazing.
The Domestic Violence Center.
The Domestic Violence Center, absolutely. And she had a degree in social work. Her family are big developers. You heard of the Bexley Corporation. She passed away just a few years ago. But she was for social work. She worked in the prisons and all kinds of things. And along the way, she had a pilot's license. Her daughter was telling us she flew a crop plane that would descend very quickly. She was, again, fearless, but saved a lot of lives, really. Everybody that I talked to said, don't forget Sylvia Young, don't forget Sylvia Young. I don't know about you, but I sure wish we had Sylvia Young right now. She was just the fearless defender. She is a cousin of the Bellamy brothers. She's probably one of their groupies too, but she is their first cousin. But on the county commission, I believe one of the longest periods of time, she wanted to protect our land and our way of life. She was a wonderful person, and locally she saved the courthouse and furnished the courthouse herself. And sorry? Yes, she was instrumental. Yes, with the actually garden club as well. Joan Pryor was a state president of the garden club, and we used to work a lot with Pat Mallory when I was in student services. Ann Hildebrand was another one. They were all real champions of individual rights. Okay, so tonight, in no particular order, and Brian said he would help me with this. Do you want to take over, Brian? I don't think Pat Weaver came, but she's... Brian is the MC.
Okay. I will do my best. Took extra decongestants and antihistamines. Well, so Bermice, would you like to talk for a little bit first?
Sure.
You're on the front of on the top of the list. Now, yeah. If you'd like to sit, I can grab you a chair. take extra decongestants today. The pollen grabbed me yet again.
Bermice is going to be talking about a trailblazer, but she also is a trailblazer. You'll see that very quickly.
I didn't hear you, Madonna. What did you say?
I said she's going to be talking about a trailblazer, but she is also a trailblazer.
Yes. Good afternoon. I made some notes because my daughter says when I speak I ramble. So I'm not going to ramble tonight. I'm going to stick to the topic. Okay. Okay. I'm going to speak about Christine Mickens. As a little girl, I realized, who is this pretty lady sitting in church? We attended the same church until she passed. Beautifully dressed. And throughout the years, I found out why. Now, not only was she beautifully dressed, but she was poised, and I am standing in the wrong position right now. I should have one foot pointed and this one like this, and this is the way I'm supposed to stand when I'm speaking to public. All right. She loved God, and she loved people. She served people tirelessly, and I'll tell you. All right. She always wore a suit. I never saw her in a dress. And as we matriculated to the different grade levels at Moore Academy, Mickens High School, each grade level was assigned a home economics task beginning with 9th grade. All right. When Ms. Mickens spoke, people listened. That was the most important thing. She was a negotiator. She was a listener. She was a nurturer, compromiser, and she was a happy person. Yeah, I think I made her angry a couple of times, but that didn't count. She always had a smile. She was a home economics teacher, and she was hired back in the 50s, I believe. In the 30s, yeah. And as Professor Mickens, her husband, added more classes to Moore Academy and Mickens High School, she became a home economics teacher. All right, as a home economics teacher, these are the assignments we had. For 9th grade, you learned some basic sewing skills. You had the option of making a 2-piece unlined suit. Okay. You had to plan menus for Mickens High School, for the students. For the entire student body, we had to plan menus for breakfast and for lunch for the entire school. We had to prepare grocery lists for those meals. We had to figure out how much rice we needed, how much flour we needed, how much meal we needed. Now, the vegetables came from the 4-H group. The boys, there was a dynamic, and the boys hated them. They had to work the gardens from sun up to sundown, and you still had to sit in class and get all your assignments done, and you had to help tend the garden in the summer. So we kept that going. All right. Now, this is the one I really hated. I was the only girl, and I had 8 brothers. So I used to get my allowance, I was not a big spender because I spent my daddy's money and I kept mine. So one of the things she did in 9th grade was to make a home visit to every female 9th grader and check their bedrooms. Whether the bed was made properly, because we learned that in school. Okay? And she also, and I still have this fanatic today, the baseboards,
Oh, yeah.
if they had dust on them, oh, you got to mark down. Okay? She didn't play about that. All right, in 10th grade, you had to go shopping with the group. So the 10th graders had to take the menus, the grocery list that the 9th graders prepared, and plan, pick up, order the groceries, and bring them back to the cafeteria. Now, I don't know whether you guys know how luxurious our meals were at Bickens High School. We had cooks back there who washed greens, who cut up greens, and cooked greens. We had cornbread, homemade biscuits, smothered pork chops, fried chicken. We had all of those things based on the grocery list that the 9th graders developed, of course, with Miss Mickens' approval. Okay. Not only was she a great seamstress, but she was a dynamic cook and a dynamic baker. All right? So, we also, in 10th grade, had to make Miss Homecoming's gown. My 10th grade experience was 60 yards of mint green net under a silk skirt, and it was layered. You had this layer was tighter, and it got looser and looser as you got 60 yards. Yeah. And one year we didn't have the money. I guess the band, we had more band members, and not all the band members had uniforms, and we didn't have money to purchase them. So what did we do? We bought material and we made them.
And they were wool, right?
Yes.
Made of wool.
And you could not tell the difference from the bought uniforms from the made uniforms. That's how meticulous she was.
Did she only make the girls do all these things, by the way?
Yeah, back then it was just the girls. All right. And my 10th grade year, I jumped frogging, right? Okay, I'm going to make a two-piece suit, but it's plaid on one side and it's solid on the other. Beautiful colors, not bold, but really, really nice pastel colors. I bet I sewed on that suit for a whole year. I just remember her doing, that's how she ripped the seams. Those plaids had to match across. When you held your arms down, all of the plaids had to match. So I don't wear plaids to this day. That was back in 1960. And I wore the suit on the plaid side once, and then I wore it on the solid side once, and then I wore a plaid and a solid, the plaid jacket and the solid skirt once, and I accidentally lost it somewhere. Never again. My mom searched for it, and she searched for it, but she couldn't find it. All right. Okay, in 10th grade, we also had to learn to cook. There were certain things you had to learn to cook. Because if you didn't go to college, or if you went to college and you lived in a dorm, not all the time could you get to the cafe. So, you had to learn to cook breakfast foods. You had to make eggs, scrambled or fried, but they couldn't be brown. You couldn't have that brown stuff on them. I don't eat brown stuff on my eggs today. Grits, bacon, sausage, and pancakes. Those were the basics. And if you felt froggy, I was froggy. I wanted to bake a cake. I wanted to bake my favorite, which is a German chocolate cake. The most difficult cake in the world to make properly. But we finally got through it, and I think my 4th cake was satisfactory to her, and it was acceptable, and I could bring it home to my mom. Now, what my mom cheated, because when I had a baking project at home, she just did it. And it was kind of perfect, so she knew my mom did it. They went to church together. All right, in 11th grade, you continued sewing. You continued helping the 9th graders with sewing activities. We learned knitting, crocheting. She did all of that stuff. And she was beautifully dressed. Did I say that once?
Yes.
I need to say that many times. You never saw her not perfectly manicured from head to toe. And my thing was, I wanted to be just like Miss Mickens. All right. I didn't want to sew. I didn't want to cook. I didn't want to do any of that. And my mama said, you can get a husband who can do all those things and you can work. Okay, so I said, okay, I'm not doing that. He's supposed to take care of me. I'm not taking care, just like y'all taking care of me, he's supposed to do the same thing. I'm not doing that. So Miss Mickens had a little come to Jesus meeting with me and told me what my expectations were. The other thing she did, some Saturdays she would get a group of us girls together in her car and take us, I think the upscale stores was like Moss Brothers at the time. So when you went in Moss Brothers, you looked at the jacket, you looked at the price tag, you looked at the jacket, and you looked at those seams and the linings and if they were straight and if, this is a $30 suit. We're not paying $70 for this. So I learned how to go into stores, and I'm a bargain shopper, so I go to the bargain rack, but check out the best of the bargain. So you just don't buy anything. And I still can't just buy anything to this day. The other thing was, when you sat down, ladies always sit with their legs crossed at the ankle. Said, okay, here we go. She would walk up to you and say, are you a lady? I said, oh, yes ma'am, I guess. You know, where should your knees be? Where should your ankles be? And she kept us going like that until we either got married and left, or until we went off to college. And Bethune-Cookman was her college. And she wanted every female that came through Moore Mickens to go to Bethune. That was it. No questions. I'll get you a scholarship. I'll get you funding. Got to get your grades. But we'll do that. So that's what I have about Mrs. Mickens. I have a hard time even coming close to measuring up to what I believe she is and what her expectations for me were. She was part of the reason that she said I was just so smart. I could go get my doctorate degree. And my dad had said that to me ever since I was a little girl. Every summer, you're going to be a doctor. And I said, and if I become a doctor, you're going to call me Dr. Bermice. So that kept on. My dad passed before I got my doctorate, but I got it. And so I know Miss Mickens is proud, and I know my dad is extremely proud.
Oh, man.
So that's it. And Miss Vera Goodwin, the only thing I knew about her was that she was principal in Lacucci at Florida Academy. And her husband was Coach Goodwin. He taught math. And he was kind of a strap person. Multiplication. 6 times 7 is what? And it was just, he was just a little off, that's all. But it was, she was related to Mr. Elwin Lucas, who lives across the street from me. Yes. They were sister and brother. I think I have that right.
You're correct.
Yes. Yes. So that's really all. She was a very quiet person, and she attended St. Paul, I believe.
She did. She was a piano player,
Mm-hmm.
and she was the principal at Florida Academy out here on Mousetown Road. Probably one of the most outstanding things about her was that, you know, in this Jim Crow educational system, where you could not get an advanced degree in certain areas in the state of Florida, like Florida A&M was the flagship school for African Americans. But they just started doctoral programs maybe about 40 years ago. So she found a way to get a master's degree in administration and supervision from NYU in 1953. And Mr. Mickens followed her in 1954. So many of these teachers, they were getting master's degree by going to school during the summertime. And I just wanted to add to Bermice, she mentioned Bethune, but they came here because Ms. Bethune recommended Mr. Mickens to the superintendent to be the principal at Moore Mickens. So that was the connection. So they are actually proteges of one of Mrs. Roosevelt's best friends.
Yes.
That's wonderful.
And Ms. Mickens was a commissioner.
Right.
Yes.
She was commissioner.
Yes.
And I think she was the first African-American commissioner.
Female.
Female.
Yeah. He was first.
And
Yeah.
she, after he passed away, she
She was appointed.
Yes. Yeah.
And her name is, I mean, I hear, people are, it just has such a ring in terms of history. That's such a wonderful story.
Oh, thank you.
It's great to hear that you have. I did have a picture of her. Go ahead.
Thank you very, very much. We have actually a portrait painted by Jerry Farmer of Ms. Mickens in the Cummer building. And Mr. Mickens
And there's Bermice. I found that in the paper today, looking around. She taught at, like I mentioned, at Cogs and was an administrator. But this is Christine here.
well, I believe that Margarita Romo is next. Nope, Lynn Tepper.
They're kind of a team.
Well, we know who's in charge, right?
Right.
So I'll turn it over to Lynn Tepper.
Thank you. Margarita, I would never, ever try to challenge your decision. No. We go way, way back. Margarita is my friend. And my perspective is very different than, I'm sure, Margarita's perspective, because she had not only her sex against her, her gender, but she was of Mexican descent, and that was a further problem. It's tough enough being a white female, candidly, and particularly I'm 69, and when I grew up, I went to a college that had been part of Columbia University. Can you hear me all right? Everybody? But when they decided to allow women in, Columbia said, I don't think so. And the school broke away. It was Bard College, a small liberal arts college on the Hudson River. I was a drama dance major. So at any rate, when I finally decided to apply to law school, and it was after I graduated from college, because they were picking on, we were trying to negotiate a dinner theater where the Winter Olympics were going to be in upstate New York. And it was obvious they were going to take advantage of us because, after all, we were just theater people. And so I said, I'm smart. I could go to law school. I'll learn how to negotiate my own contracts. And that's why I decided to go to law school. But I turned to one of my mother's friends, who was a longtime attorney, one of our family's dearest friends, and I ran the idea past him, asking him, what do you think? Where should I try to apply to go to law school? And by the way, when you decide this in August, you can't go anywhere in September. You have to take law boards and things like that. So I finally was able to take them, so I could be eligible in January. I took them in December and was eligible to go in January. But when I asked him, he said, oh, Lynn, why don't you just get married? That was 1974, that was the attitude. So I did get into Stetson. It was the only school that took mid-year, because once I made up my mind, I was like, I'm going now. But nowhere else in the country did they take in January. And hey, I was a drama dance major, so studying, taking tests, really not my thing. So I was on probation my first semester. And my mentor, my probation officer, professor, a male, said to me, why are you even here? Just get married. I've already made it into law school and you're still pushing. Did you come here for your MRS degree? Not your JD, your MRS degree? But I buckled down and decided I really did know how to study and take tests, and I did fine, and I got out of Stetson. Well, not long after I graduated, I married a fellow Stetson grad who graduated a little bit ahead of me, and we went to get our marriage license, and I wanted to maintain my maiden name. My mother hated her middle name, and she always wanted me to keep my maiden name, which is Tepper, as my middle name. And my ex-husband was County Judge Bill Sestak, so I was going to be Lynn Tepper Sestak. Oh, the clerk of court just did not like me using my maiden name. And then we had a hard time, and I learned through the education Madonna's given us, it was, 40 years or so prior to that, they had gotten the right to keep their maiden name. Because as you know, it was always just Mrs. So-and-so. It was never anybody who had a first name, let alone a maiden name, and they didn't inherit. So then I went to work, after I clerked for a bankruptcy judge in Tampa. I worked in the public defender's office, and I had a secretary who would type your letters, an older woman from up in Maine, and I told her, this is how I want my signature done, Lynn Tepper Sestak. She typed Lynn Sestak. No, Lynn Tepper Sestak. We went round and round on that. These days it would not be a challenge at all, but 1977 it was a problem. And so then along the way, when I was living in Dade City and practicing as an assistant public defender in Newport Richey, and then I had run against an incumbent judge, almost won, but I lost, but that's all good, all good. But when I was running, the entree for me to Dade City, I was from Long Island, New York. You think Dade City people in the late 70s on a girl from New York? And so, because my husband, who then was shortly thereafter my ex-husband, knew everybody, and he was a member of the bar. I was invited to things I would not have been invited to as a single or unknown divorced female lawyer in town. Fortunately, a lot of men and women in Dade City who had been here for a long time took me under their wing, and they helped me become part of the Dade City proper. And I continued to live in Dade City since 1977. I've been here a long time. But along the way, when I then went into private practice and I was representing women, I began to discover there's a lot of gender bias in the courts. Number one, our laws were blind. I wish they were blind, or they were ignorant, let me just put it that way. Because there were no criteria on deciding so that it would be fair and neutral on who got custody, whether you got permanent alimony, whether there should be child support, and how much child support. And as it ended up, women ended up in poverty very quickly after divorce. There's been study after study done. And the men that were getting divorced ended up with the bulk of the assets and the higher income. Well, after I was in private practice, I ran and I was elected to a new seat. And because I was a woman in a rural part of the state, when they decided to create the Gender Bias Study Commission, I was a good one to put on, because I was from the right part of the state, and I was a woman. They wanted to have diversity on the Gender Bias Study Commission. And so this is the report. This is 32 years ago, this report. And I look back on it now, and it really is shocking. But what's also shocking to me is about 5 or 6 years ago, one of the presidents of the Florida Bar came and spoke to I was a circuit judges conference, and talked about what was going on in law firms in terms of how many women were advancing to become partners or becoming judges and things like that. And it was so disheartening to know that things actually hadn't changed a lot. Now keep in mind, when I entered Stetson, there were no women that had graduated in the class that had just graduated. In my class of 106 people, there were 12 women. And the women on the bench were only 12%. And I was one of the youngest, regardless of my gender, when I became a judge at age 32. And so it was when we took testimony from around the state, all of us, there were Supreme Court justice, appellate court judges, private attorneys, people that worked in the field as stakeholders, domestic violence centers, social workers. It was shocking to us to find out what bias there was in law enforcement and domestic violence. And as a result of our recommendations, we decided that we wanted to create a domestic violence task force. There was just too much to do. You can't imagine how deficit the laws were. There just were. There weren't domestic violence injunctions in those days. You couldn't throw somebody out of the house. And if somebody stalked you, didn't even exist, let alone cyber stalking. And so I had attended a meeting. Besides being on this, I was part of 5 that was sent to a program in San Francisco to learn about domestic violence. And they wanted us to have recommendations. I came back, and our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at the time was a woman, former nun, Rosemary Barquette. Our group, our #1 recommendation was, we need a domestic violence task force. So now we can take recommendations from the report from 1990, see if we can propose some law changes, things like that. Justice, and I asked her personally, she said, "Oh, Lynn, why don't we cure poverty while we're at it?" Really? This was like 1990, 91? So by that time, Governor Childs was the governor, and I had been appointed to work on the battered women's clemency review panels. We went into prisons and interviewed women who murdered their mates. But there were, at the time, there were judges, lawyers didn't know anything about battered women, domestic violence, the type of defenses that might exist, and we made recommendation, a group of us, and I was the chair of it, recommendations to the governor and cabinet whether somebody should be released from prison or not, whether they had actually had a proper defense in their case originally. So I knew the governor's special counsel because of that. So when he heard I was turned down by the Chief Justice, he went to the governor for me, and we got it. But the Chief Justice got to a point who got on the commission, but guess who didn't get appointed by the Supreme Court? I didn't get appointed to that. But Governor Childs, after that one was done, put me on the Implementation Commission to make sure the recommendations became law, to make sure we had mandatory education for judges, that we could help in educating the public, litigants, things like that. It's hard to imagine, when I look back and I read this, can you imagine, you're getting divorced, you have no income because you either left your job or your education to stay home with children. Well, my mother did that until she divorced, I understand that. But then when you get divorced, you have the kids. They didn't have a lot of early learning centers in those days. And if you didn't get alimony or the house or adequate child support, what do you do? And so the goal was to make sure we had findings so that, okay, this is what's in the best interest of a child. Let's look at this. And it was gender neutral on the needs of a child. And then they established child support guidelines so that you just looked at the incomes and the number of days or nights that a child spent with a child to neutralize it. That made all the difference in the world in being able to become equalized. But one of the harsher things was, how are you going to get a lawyer when you don't have any money? Are you going to go use a credit card that belongs to your spouse that you normally could sign on? I represented them in county court as a public defender because they'd be charged with credit card theft for charging something on their current husband's credit card. And so lawyers say, I'm not going to take your case. This is going to take a lot of time. And judges wouldn't award temporary fees. They wouldn't award adequate fees when it was all over. And that's a denial of due process, really, a denial of being able to be fully represented just based on your gender, because the gender was, it was our tradition. Women stay home. And it stayed in place for the longest time. Things have changed significantly. The laws that have come as a result of these reports are remarkable. And it's made a much more even playing field. We've educated our lawyers, our judges, anybody else that's in the field touching the life of families that have to deal with the justice system. But it was a rough road. I'm lucky that I was able to be part of the changes, and that I wasn't discouraged when they said, just go get your MRS degree. So I'm very grateful that I had a mother that told me I could do anything I wanted to do. And I can still remember when she was not allowed to apply for credit because she was a divorced woman. And then she remarried, but her husband had to be the one abroad, not her. Things like that. So I understand all of that. But I am also very happy to know that we have changed, not completely, but our attitudes in our society, that the laws have improved, that we tend to think anybody can do anything they want. And I hope that I continue to be a role model for children, for youth, for college students, and in the community to understand, and I still educate judges and anybody who will listen, that you don't need to be the trailblazer, because hopefully we've done enough that we've blazed the trails. But unfortunately, I know that's not true. There'll still be a few more trails that we need to blaze. But I was glad I was able to be the first woman elected to the Pasco County bench and to serve on the bench for 34 years. And I appreciate you putting me in the book. And I had created a trauma-informed court, which seems like a touchy-feely thing, but it's where we meet people's needs and we let everybody be heard. We make sure that they are comfortable and that we ask somebody what they need and we don't go around trying to find out what they did wrong, but to find out what happened to you so we can stop them from coming back and the next generation and the next generation, and to give people hope and build resiliency. So I'm very lucky to be placed in that position. Thank you for including me.
Aren't these two ladies trailblazers? Wow. Lynn and I had the chance to work together early on, and I just always have been in awe of her. And my two daughters, who are both attorneys, and they both spent some time with her, and I'm so glad they did. Even my son, who is also an attorney, they have great respect for her. Okay.
So, I was wondering if Ms. Nadeska would like to go next. Because I can think of nobody better to introduce Margarita, who will speak after her. Thank you, Nadeska.
By the way, this is Vera.
Hi everyone. At Madonna's last presentation, I had the honor of speaking on behalf of Margarita because she wasn't able to make it. So I just want to say quickly, Margarita, her humility, it's incredible. So sometimes it's nice when someone else speaks on her behalf because you can actually brag a little bit about all the amazing things that she's done. And I think just to sum it up, what amazes me about Margarita is who she is as a person. Because yes, on paper, she's accomplished so much in legislation and policy, on the ground, community work, like monumental work, but then at the end of the day, I think it's just her being, the way that she sees the world, the way that after all these years, she still sees a reason to fight and she still sees the good in people. I said last time, I'm 28 and there's days where I feel tired, or I'm like, what's the point? There's so much work to do, and the fact that Margarita still does what she does, the way that she does it, it's super inspiring. So I'm very inspired by her. I know a lot of people are inspired by her, so.
Well, I walk a lot slower than I used to. When I get up out of the chair, it's like, oh, I don't know if I can do it or not. But thank you very much for inviting me. And it's kind of hard. 'Cause I have so many stories that, 50 years of stories.
Can you formally pronounce who you are?
My name is Margarita Romo, and I'm a Mexican-American, come from Texas. And I am in Tommytown. I'm very proud of Tommytown. I used to not like the name, but I like it now. I figured we couldn't get rid of it, so I might as well embrace it. And I've been here 40 years, but I've been 50 years working with my community, which is the farm worker community. I am a farm worker, so I know what it is. I know that it wasn't something I wanted to stay in. But as Judge Tepper said, all the things that she said, they're right. I was told that I could I could either get married to a farm worker or I could be a maid, and I said, no, I don't want to be a maid, and I don't want to be, I want to keep doing farm work stuff because that's not going to get me anywhere. But life was not fun. And when I think about, I was looking at my mother's, for some reason my mother's tombstone came up on my Facebook yesterday. And I'm going, what? And so I looked at the day that she was born and the day that she died. And realized that she was only 32 years old when she died. So she was very young. And I was the youngest of 4 kids. I had 3 brothers. So, she wanted my dad to leave me with my godmother. He didn't do it. I ended up in an orphanage. My brothers ended up in an orphanage, but they were 3, I was 1. And the orphanage I went in, there was no Mexicans, nobody spoke Spanish, and I was the youngest child there. So when I came out, I could only speak English. And I understood what happened to the Cherokees. They didn't intentionally do it. Now when they did it to the Cherokees, they intentionally did it. But for me, it was just happened. So I come back to a community where everybody's Mexican and I can't speak the language. So I had to learn all over again, and I still, it's not perfect, but I get around. And so then after that, my dad marries a white woman, and she would have made Cinderella's stepmother look like an angel. So I learned about hate way before I learned about love. And I say that because for the work that I'm doing and have done, it's kind of interesting that I grew up in so much hate. So much hate. And I was only a little kid. And I didn't understand the hate. So I guess for me, the work that God called me to, because it's not something I thought up, I wasn't smart enough. I had 3 brothers. I watched my brothers and how they treated their wives. So for some silly reason, I thought, I'm not going to marry a Mexican. I'm going to marry a white man. They got to be better. No. No. The last one was worse than all 3 of my brothers. So I learned some more and some more. But I also learned forgiveness. So, you know, I was probably 35 years old when one day a lady knocked at my door. Little black lady. She was a pastor of a church in Tampa. Somehow she found me because I lived on a street where there wasn't a lot of folks. And she knocked on my door and said, I need an interpreter to go to a migrant camp, and you're it. Like, what? And that's the way she was. So Sister Allen invited me to go to the migrant camp. And then I realized that farm workers were still being treated the way we were treated when we were in the farm worker field. That nothing had really changed. And I was an interpreter for 7 years, so you'd think that I would already have some kind of something, you know, with the Lutheran Church. Because I'm a pastor, but I'm not a Lutheran pastor, because I didn't go to seminary. But to me, that was seminary. You just don't count it. And so, you know, all those years of translating and going through all the processes, and then when people, one day I was telling Nadeska, one day the whole camp left to go up north, and they left a little old man there. And somebody called me up and said, hey, there's somebody there. You better go see. And that migrant camp had a store, a company store. And the name of that camp was called the Blue Star. I'll never forget that. It was right about where 41 and 50 meet. 41 and 54. And so that Blue Star, I mean, they could get beer, they could get cigarettes, they could get all that kind of stuff. But in those days, nobody could come into that camp unless they were invited. And so because of Sister Ellen being where she was. And that guy that had that company store, he'd have that jukebox cranked up. But when she walked in that place, and we were going to start having church, she would walk in that place and she would disconnect it. And he didn't say a word. And no, she would bring cookies and stuff, but nobody could have anything till we got done. But, you know, unfortunately, the evangelist didn't seem to know when to quit. So sometimes we'd be translating for 3 hours. But that was something we did every Wednesday night. So we did that for 7 years. And then one day she died. And then all of a sudden, what do we do now? And so she had 3 ministries. So everybody took one of those ministries. And I ended up continuing the farm worker one. And so that's how I ended up, one day, I ended up in a divorce. I'm a broken wing. I don't have anything either, just as you said. And I have 3 kids left out of the 6 that I have to raise. I go to the farm worker camp and they are the ones that feed me. From there, I ended up, my friend saying to me one day, you've got to get educated. I didn't have a GED. Because I'd gone to a convent when I was young. And I came out of the convent. And when I wanted, the sisters wanted me to go to a Catholic school so I could get my high school diploma, my dad wouldn't let me go. So I never got it. So she said, you got to do something. So I went to PHSC. Well, now it's PHSC, but it was PHC then. And so I went there, and I was like a little kid in a candy store because I was learning and learning and learning. But I was also getting beat up because I all of a sudden didn't know how to deal with the other people. My director, where I got a little job, you know, they were telling me, well, we made you. We put clothes on you. We changed you. And so I went through a lot of stuff in Dade City. I got disinvited from places where they had asked me to speak because there was that stuff. But, you know, as I said, we just have to keep plowing through that stuff and not let it define you. And I think that's one thing I learned. So now I stand on whoever it is I am, and I know there's people that love me and people that hate me, but it's okay. It's all right. So 50 years of working with my community, we did a lot of really good things, changed a lot of laws, brought in some new laws. And I got a letter or an email yesterday, I think, or the day before that, from the USF, and it said, United. And I said, oh, they misspelled that word. No. Then I thought about it again and looked at it real good. No, it's United instead of undocumented. And they have a program at USF for DACA kids that came into the country before they were 15. And so now I can get to go share my story over there. But the reality is in Dade City there was a lot of stuff that needed to be fixed. Nobody knew there was as many farm workers. I remember Lawton Childs very well. I learned to go through the system in Tallahassee. I learned to talk to legislators. And sometimes I'd be scared to death. And some of them were really mean. And sometimes we weren't very nice to each other, you know. But like Tosano, at one time we didn't like each other at all. But then one day we came to the meeting of the minds and realized that I'm just going to fight for my people no matter where I am. And that's that. And so once we kind of bridged that gap, we were okay. So we're very good friends today. But there was a lot of different things that happened. But we made a lot of good things as well. Our streets are paved now. We have street lights. And that was only 10 years ago. 10 years ago, all of that was dark. Tommytown was dark. And not too long ago, some very, very wealthy person said to me, you should be grateful. You should be grateful. And I thought to myself, well, you know, we had to pay for it because they got impact fees on all that stuff. It wasn't free. But why shouldn't we have lights and paved streets? Everybody else does. So it's been a real hard place to be. And why God picked me, I don't know. Because I can tell you from my people, women are not the leaders. In our culture, women are not the leaders. And why did the men and the women pick me? Because I wouldn't still be there if it hadn't been for the men wanting me to be there. Maybe it was because I was older, or maybe because I was the only American citizen in the bunch. And we used to go to Tallahassee with all these undocumented kids and play music for the governor. And one day he was coming out of his office and I took all the kids over there and they shook hands. And he didn't know he was shaking hands with a bunch of undocumented kids. And because we had a good laugh. So, I mean, we went a lot of places and they never bothered us because they assumed that we wouldn't be taking anybody up there that would be in danger. We saw kids get taken away. We saw and we've heard. We had one lady that she came to our office one day and she brought the newspaper article. Her husband was undocumented. He was from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Mexican. He was coming from Louisiana to meet his family in Dade City. They stopped and picked him up, deported him. 2 days later, he was dead on the other side. Because the bad people, when you cross over, if you don't join them, they just kill you. And so she brings me a picture of her dead husband. We had all sorts of things happen. that are just really sad. And I didn't like the Border Patrol when it came through here before 1986. And in 1986, we had an amnesty, and we were able to get a lot of people processed that are today American citizens. But there are still a lot of people that aren't. And they've been waiting for a very long time, and they've been out there picking the strawberries that we enjoy, and picking the tomatoes and everything else, and they're still not able to get any support. And somebody will say, well, why did they come anyway? Why didn't they stay on the other side? Well, who would do their work? And remember, when I was working in 1971, and these migrant camps were hidden, where nobody knew where they were, but the farmer and the crew leader. And they brought them over. And now they're here. Now what are you going to do with them? Now let's send them back. So there's a whole other issue. And whenever we say the Pledge of Allegiance, I have to tell you that when we get to with liberty and justice for all, it kind of sticks in my throat, because there isn't liberty and justice for all. And there's always been a group of people that have been used and abused. There always have been, and probably always will be. But you know, those of us that have decided to stand up and walk and crawl to that light, we've made it. We have undocumented kids today. We have one that's a lawyer. And he's still undocumented because he's DACA. But he's still undocumented. We have nurses that are taking care of the sick. In Pasco County, they're still undocumented, but they're nurses. And why do we stay in that little house on Locke Street? Because we put the money that we could get into the community. Let me tell you, the people in that little house are people that have sacrificed. We have women that have worked there 20 years. Just got a raise to $10 because we don't have any money. And we put in appropriations. Well, we didn't get it. But you know what? We're going to keep working. We're going to keep working until we get to where we need to be. And I appreciate having Nadeska here. And I appreciate having Vicki here. And I appreciate Judge Tepper. Because let me tell you something, I know one thing for sure. None of us get to where we're going alone. None of us. And there has been someone taking my hand, because let me tell you something, I'm a very scared little girl. I am not as brave as you think I am. But I have to keep talking and I have to keep walking. But at night, it's another story. And God's been good to me. I have no complaints because He has been good to me. I'm 85 years old, and if I can still work a full day, that's great. Do I want to retire? No. What? You got to sleep. I mean, your heart's going to beat whether you're laying on the couch watching TV or doing whatever things make you happy. But for me, it makes me happy doing what I'm doing. And God is good. So if it hadn't been for Judge Tepper, you know, they had a big thing for her one day when she was retiring. And there was these women that sat at our table. And they weren't really nice to us because we weren't dressed like everybody else was dressed there. But let me tell you, I don't dress up very often. So I went right after work. So I'm just like I was. So we were sitting around the table, and then Judge Tepper is presented, and then she asks me to go up there. Not anybody else. Do you get it? Me. Little old ugly me goes up there in my little ugly clothes, and she presents me. I tell you what, I'll never forget that. I will never forget that. So that has happened all the way through my life. And I've had moms that replaced that woman. But let me tell you something about that woman. one day I learned, because I'm always trying to learn, I went to PHSC to learn about mental health because I took just about every course that they had there in psychology because I was trying to figure out who I was and what was wrong with me. But I learned that my stepmother probably didn't have a very good life herself. And so she was already upset and mad. And here my dad brings her 4 kids. And what? She's just a young girl herself. So I was able to forgive her. I never said anything to her. I never brought it up. I never mistreated her. And the day she died, I could look down at her and know I was okay. And I think she loved me in her own way at the end. So see, one thing I'm trying to teach is for us to be forgiven, and it's hard. And Vicki takes me through she pulls me through sometimes when I'm being really nasty. But the reality is that at the very end of the day, you know, I always say, I'm just a little old lady. And you know, there's that song that says, he took 100 pounds of clay. And I don't remember the rest of it. But I remember that part, and once upon a time I was only 100 pounds. And he took that 100 pounds and he did what he did. So whatever it is that I is because of him. And I give him the glory. And I tell you what, my people, they're wonderful. And their stories and more stories. They could tell you stories of their life and their struggle and where they have gotten to be today. So today, you know, in 1979 when I came here, there was not an Hispanic in a doctor's office or in the courthouse or anywhere. They were out in the fields. They were all out in the fields. Not anymore. They're professionals all over the place. And guess what? They all somehow touched farm worker self-help. And so that little old place on Lock Street is a lighthouse. It's a lighthouse that says, we're here. We're here. And you can grow. You can grow. Watch. Come. Learn. We're about education. We're about advocacy. And we're about organizing. Those are the 3 things you can count on. God bless you and thank you for having us here.
Margarita mentions PHSC or Pasco Community College, we used to call it. And Amani, she's one of the distinguished alumni, is she not?
Yes, she is a distinguished.
She's also in the Civil Rights Hall of Fame for Florida. She was the Hispanic Woman of the Year fairly recently. She has a series of accolades, and if you haven't seen her,
She's a lightning hero.
a lightning hero. She is incredibly humble, as Nadeska and I say, but if you've seen her in action, you really ought to go visit her and see her in action. She is a powerhouse, and I believe she saved many lives. And I can tell you, when I went to the historic board to write the history of Dade City, that was the first name they told me to talk to, Margarita. And that says something about the city commission and the historic board. They said you absolutely have to include her. That's an integral part of this history. And I was able to, we've been joking for years that we're going to write the history. Now we think we might write it from a children's perspective, and Nadeska would help us. But I was able to dedicate the book to her, so thank you so much, Margarita.
I was going to say, you had mentioned Lucy Morgan early on, and she was the first distinguished alumni of Pasco.
Oh, really?
And for some work she did against gangsters or something on a very great and courageous. That's all.
Yeah, right. Okay, one more person, I think, who's reluctant. Here she is.
What's the picture?
Sally and I share a background in IT. But I always have a kindred spirit with my fellow tech geek nerd peoples, although you're not one.
One of what? One of
your fellow.
You're not geeky at all.
Oh, I'm very geeky.
But I just want to introduce Sally Redden.
Am I supposed to sing or dance?
So either.
Every time I get a microphone in my hand, I want to sing.
You know, I noticed, this is a comment, when I put all of these ladies together, I noticed a profound situation where a lot of them were artistic. A lot of them had done dance or drama or even sewing. It was interesting. I must have talked to Ernie in my sleep several times, but I was like, these are really multifaceted women. And a lot of the women that became mayors started out beautifying the community. And then they're like, I want to do more than plant gardens. You know, it was really interesting. So I think there's something about leadership and having that artistic.
I kind of agree with you. You know, I always, when I was just starting in grade school, I got to sing on KJCF radio station, and I had fan mail. And I was just a little girl. My favorite song was Over the Rainbow, and then people would request that. You know, I thought I was a star. I mean, a real star. You know, it was just so much fun. And then now I have a son, I'll brag, that has gone to Juilliard, and he is a musician. And everyone asked me where he get that talent, and I said, I don't know. Especially when we went to the school, my husband is a builder, and I'm an IT network specialist. Now, how does that roll into music? It doesn't. But he is amazing. But I think probably you're right. From that early day, you do have that affinity for music, especially I like classical music and jazz. So those were good beginnings for him. You know, I know we're all tired. And I'm not going to really go into what, but I talked to my husband, and I said, you know, I'm not a trailblazer. In fact, I even talked to Lonnie about that tonight. And I said, you know, but he said, well, what Madonna wants to know is, what is it that you did in your life that inspired other women? And asked them, or to show them, by example, how they can also grow. And by paying it forward, you're sort of, you know, each person here, like whether you're teaching your daughter, you know, good manners or how to live a nice life and how to be kind to other people, which you're paying it forward. You're trailblazing, you're doing that. And I kind of think of myself that way. So I'll just shortly say that I had a couple of things. I ended up, when I retired, I looked up and I thought, how did this little girl from Podunk, I mean really Podunk, poor, you know, like most of us could have been back in that time, and didn't have a lot, and how did she get here? How did she become a communication network engineer at Verizon? How did that happen, you know? Well, it happened because of a lot of people like Lynn and Margarita, people that were inspiring me to do a better job, you know, and actually even when you're scared to death that you're going to fail, to just keep trying. And so I got into a program in 1976, and it was also created by an amazing woman that saw that in the government, I worked for the federal government, United States Army Mobility Equipment Command, as a clerk typist. But a lot of women there were clerk typists, not so many men, but a lot of women. So she developed this upward mobility program, had 5 different categories, and there were 2, one that I desperately wanted. I desperately wanted to be the human resources candidate. And the second one that I chose was IT. I mean, it was not called that. It was a computer network, computer technology back then. And so I only picked that because those were the only 2 that weren't connected to being a government employee for the rest of my life, which I didn't want to do. So I didn't get the job for the HR or the position. I was devastated. So then I didn't get the one for IT either. Then I was really devastated. I thought, oh gosh, there's no hope. This is it for me. I couldn't afford to go to college full time and also have my children daycare, pay for daycare, do all of those things. I couldn't do that. So anyway, one of the people in the IT program decided she didn't want to do it. And I was the next on the list. So one of the luckier days of my life. And anyway, 3.5-year program composed of on-the-job training, they call it Delta. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's just like computer-based training today. And then I had a mentor, and they would test you. And then you would have jobs that supported the technology that you had just learned. An amazing way to learn because it reinforces then, what you had just learned and makes you remember it. And then you go on to the next thing. I went on through multiple languages, COBOL, Fortran, Assembler, things I thought I could never do in a million years because, I made a B in math, I made A's in everything else, and I thought I didn't know and was not good at math because I got a B. My husband said, a little crazy, because he's a math teacher, and he said, maybe did you ever think it might have been just a bit harder for you? No, I thought I just couldn't do it. So anyway, of course, IT relates to a lot of math. It's what they say. I don't know. I guess it does. That didn't seem to for me. But anyway, the one thing that I did think I had almost flunked out and was willing to quit that day is I took basic assembler class, which is the primary native language, I guess, of IBM and being a programming person. That's next to coding and binary, I guess. And I called my husband, it was a week, I'm bawling my eyes out. I'm not going to make it. I'm not going to make it. I'm failing. I'm coming home. And he goes, you can do this. You really know you can do this. Same husband, by the way, I dated in high school. So he says, you can do this. And I said, I can't. So I went back, got in my hotel room because he wouldn't come and get me. And I said, how can I do this? Well, I'd taken COBOL. I took structured programming in COBOL. And I thought, this BAL, it just doesn't make sense. It's so convoluted and it's so everywhere. So I said, well, maybe if I tried doing it in a structured manner, like COBOL. And sure enough, it worked. And the guy that taught it said, I don't think I've ever seen anybody do this. But he said, it worked. He said, you've really accomplished something I haven't ever seen anybody else do. It made me really feel good. Anyway, I got through the whole program. Took 3.5 years. I went from a level 4, GS4, grade level, to a grade level 9. I worked there 6 more months and then I left because I wanted to go into business because I'd always heard, that's good enough for government work. I didn't want to be good enough for government work. I really wanted to get out there and see how I could do in the world. And my husband, he was a little worried because, I had the insurance on my side and I had my retirement on that side. But we risked that and it worked out okay because I got picked up by Concha. And I worked there for the rest of the time, all through the transitions of name, jobs, places to live. I got transferred several times. But I think the story is that I succeeded, even when I didn't think I could. And I think other people that I worked with, I was always really good about trying to mentor other people and to help them. And I think they succeeded because I was a good example, and I did think that you could do just about anything if you work hard enough at trying to do it. So anyway, I cut
I speak down a lot from where I started, but then I added a few things because I also ramble. But I do have to tell you, I took home ec, miserable at home ec. I made an apron in the sewing project. It was yellow with a brown pockets. The brown pockets fell off immediately because I didn't backstitch. I can remember this to this day.
So Christine would not be happy, right?
I remember the
And I'm
ribbon.
definitely not standing correctly. But I can dance.
There are numerous pictures in the book from Sally. She's a wonderful photographer, and she should be in there as a trailblazer. She really is. But I have so many of her pictures in the book. And you know what? My home ec teacher was Cora St. Almond, and she told my mother there was no hope. My mother sent me every summer to the summer camp at the high school. But then when we got to the cross stitching on the wool skirts, you know, that I did it perfectly. And she was like jumping up and down. To this day, people ask me to hem things for
I
me.
would like to add something about home ec. I then went to cooking. I was miserable at that too. But I did learn, for some reason, how to make great biscuits and gravy. I would get up every single morning, this is true, and make biscuits and gravy for my father. And finally he begged me, please, I am getting so fat. I said, well, I'll have to make something else.
Well, I do have copies of the book, and I will then turn it back over. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this story.
Brian, I do have one little announcement, if we have announcements later.
Sure. So I just wanted to thank you all for coming, and the speakers who have shared your struggles, your life stories, your experience. I think Trailblazers of Tampa Bay, and I love the name because there are people that go first, that blaze the trail, that clear the trail, that make it easier to whatever extent for those that come after. One of the phrases is standing on the shoulders, and you guys have strong shoulders. So thank you for coming tonight.
Thanks to the museum and the Historical Society for hosting.
Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to mention again that we have the Nova Era tickets here for sale, fundraising for the museum. It's 2 weeks from tomorrow. It's going to be a wonderful evening concert, Nova Era. And we just have some tokens of appreciation for the speakers tonight. Doug Sanderson's going to hand out